Some startling findings this week about the effect of birth control pills on women's health. Father Tadpole of the National Catholic Bioethics Center explains. And National Review Online's KATHRYN LOPEZ talks about faith-based adoption as well as her new devotional, A Year with the Mystics. And mother of poet and peace advocate Mattie Stepanek, Dr. Jenny Stepanek, returns for an update on her son's cause for sainthood and his message. And finally, my exclusive interview with Bishop ATHANASIUS SCHNEIDER about his new book, Christus Vincit, The World Over, begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. A great show for you tonight. Father Tadpole, KATHRYN LOPEZ, Jenny Stepanek, Bishop ATHANASIUS SCHNEIDER. They're all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. Let's get started. A recent medical study uncovered some startling findings about the adverse effects of birth control pills and how they may affect a woman's health. Does Obamacare allow a religious exemption for paying for abortion services? The answers might surprise you. Director of Education at the National Catholic Bioethics Center, Father Tadpole, joined me earlier with some analysis. Father, thank you for being here.
Great to join you.
Now, I want to start with this story about health care in the state of California. Turns out a state appeals court ruled earlier this year against a Catholic women's organization, and they ruled that abortion must be considered a medically necessary procedure requiring coverage, regardless of religious objection. Now, I thought Obamacare carved out religious exemptions. Does it not?
It doesn't entirely. In certain states, you are able to have insurance coverage that specifically excludes abortion. But in California, they went the extra distance, the extra mile, if you will, to make sure that every plan there did cover abortion.
Was this ever put up to a public debate?
No, this was kind of backroom dealings. There were Planned Parenthood individuals who were pressuring state workers in California to get them to do this without opening it up for public discussion.
So California is not the only state that denies a religious exemption for this.
Well, it's not. That's correct. I mean, it's not the only state. Massachusetts is a state that also doesn't offer coverage that would allow for somebody to buy insurance without having to pay to cover other people's abortions.
I want to move to the UK for a moment, Father. In the UK, the Royal College of Obstetricians is encouraging women to handle their own abortions at home. Okay, basically taking pills that would induce abortion. How safe is this?
This is not safe. This is something that is typically done in the U.S. with a great deal of supervision. It has become very, very commonplace both in the U.S. and overseas.
Is this why we see the abortion rate going down? Because they're
it
doing
may
these
well be. People are speculating that there's more of these abortions by pill than surgical abortions. And women are doing this earlier on. But the safety question is a real concern that you take 2 pills, it has to be separated by an appropriate amount of time, and you have to be monitoring for side effects and other risks.
I want to get into an odd story. This is in Ohio, and it's a bill proposed in the state legislature that would potentially cause doctors to face jail time for performing abortions. But there's a weird provision here about reimplanting an ectopic pregnancy. But there's no procedure to do that. Explain to people what all that means.
Okay, so this law basically said that there will be cases where if a doctor were to take a pregnancy that occurs outside the uterus, and this means usually in the fallopian tube, and try to rescue it, move that to the uterus, then that would not constitute an abortion. But there's no such procedure for moving it from the fallopian tube to the uterus that's been proven. And so this was a very strange thing where it appeared that the people who drafted this law did not check with experts regarding how you handle ectopic pregnancies. Now, ectopic pregnancies are a threat to the life of the mother.
Right.
Because if it's in that tiny little tube and the pregnancy grows, there's a chance it's going to break, and you're going to have, a situation where both the mother and the child will die. So this requires an intervention, and it requires you actually to act on the mother's body to remove the tube. You realize there is a pregnancy within,
right,
but this is not a direct abortion. That's the critical point. You're acting on the mother's body.
Because it's not viable. I mean, it's not
viable. This is not a situation that can continue. So it's necessary to, this is called the principle of double effect,
right,
to kind of use the fancy terminology. But you realize these lawmakers were not aware of this. And Raymond, this is one of the reasons I often say to people, they need to get a little bit of extra formation around these areas. Our center, the National Catholic Bioethics Center, we have formation in this that's online, a special course in bioethics. Just mention it for the benefit of
these are thorny, complex issues that don't lend themselves to
quick
the old
sound bites.
Right, to quick sound bites or the old ways of doing things or considering them. So it does take a certain special eye and knowledge to delve into these issues, which is why I'm glad you're here. Now, there was a study released this week that had startling results about the birth control pill and how it can have a negative effect on women's neurological health. What's the story?
Yeah, it seems that certain regions of women's brains following extended use of the birth control pill may actually get smaller. So I think it was in the hippocampus in some of those areas, or maybe it was the hypothalamus, I forget, but it was a concern to be able to, show that this was demonstrable by studies, raising the question, we have millions and millions of women who use the birth control pill.
Well, the study said that these women who are on prolonged use of the pill, they have a smaller hypothalamus. Now, what does that regulate?
That regulates the pituitary gland below it and many of the basic hormonal kinds of functions of the rest of the body.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I came across that study and I thought, why haven't I heard more about this? And why?
It's something brand new.
Yeah, it's
nobody expected to find this kind of a result.
Wow. Now, I want to unravel this bioethical tangle. In the UK, a British lesbian couple have become the first parents to carry a baby in both wombs. Okay? Now, this seems like the brave new world we're embarking on here. Explain how this came about. Now, the research I've done, they gestated the egg in one woman's womb and then transplanted it in the other, but then they move it back.
Yeah, that's correct.
It's bizarre.
It's from one body to another for a short period of time, kind of an incubatory step, and then a transfer in which you attempt to carry out the implantation. And so then this looks like, well, it's sort of a double gestation. It's amazing how as we go down these paths of same-sex marriage and so on, that people are looking for all these odd new permutations to establish pregnancies or to do pregnancies in completely unorthodox ways. And I think part of the issue here is, we got to remember we're manipulating and manhandling human embryos, subjecting them to unnecessary risks, all to be able to say, oh, 2 women carried, or or a man or 2 men somehow, went through various manipulations to be able to say that they were both fathers in some,
right.
I've heard.
And this is using IVF technology.
It's always using IVF technology. And I mean, when you have homosexual men do this, sometimes you'll have a situation where they will mix the sperm from 2 men and use that for the in vitro fertilization. And then you say, well, we don't know who the dad is, kind of thing. Now, of course, that's just a subterfuge. If you were to just do a genetic
DNA
profile, on the child, you would know which one was the father. So it's unfortunate that we are subjecting young humans to risks like this just to satisfy parental desires.
I want to move ahead to something in China. We've been hearing news about a scientist who may or may not be, depending on the reportage, conducting experiments into the world's first gene-edited child. What does this entail? Is this more of the same?
Well, this is a story that has gone back a number of months now. A Chinese researcher successfully gene-edited 2 babies, apparently. Now, when I say successfully, that's what all the shooting is about now. People are saying, well, we just read the scientific paper, and there's some doubt that he actually succeeded in doing what he claimed he did, and there may actually be some untoward effects here. In other words, the genes that he thought he modified, he didn't, and he may have modified other ones, and we can't believe the claims that he has made. They appear to be unsubstantiated. So, and he's actually, as far as I know, he's still under house arrest in China after doing this.
Well, what does this gene editing entail? I mean, you know, is there potential benefit here?
Well, there is, but not on the level of embryos. In other words, you have to usually do maybe a dozen embryos and start checking and seeing which ones were you successful with.
So you're destroying a bunch of lives here.
Destroying a bunch of them along the way. But gene editing has good uses. So, for example, if you have some blood disease, like maybe sickle cell anemia, go in and you change one gene that affects the shape of those cells, put those cells back into my body.
Is that morally illicit?
That's going to be allowable. That kind of approach will be perfectly acceptable.
Because you're not talking about the loss of any life.
And you're fixing your own cells, which have the problems. So these kinds of approaches, you know, this is the difficulty with modern science. You have these incredible powers on the one hand, and you, on the other hand, have to have some ethical discernment to be able to use them intelligently and sensibly. And this is where the church has such a vital role to play.
Well, I want to end on a happier note, since we often, I drag you into these horrible, dark corners of the brave new world. Out of Corpus Christi, the bishop there in Texas, he donated his own bone marrow to a woman, saving her life. Now, these are stem cells we're talking about.
Yes.
What's the distinction here? People don't quite grasp this.
Yes, well, this bishop, Bishop Mulvey, I was just with him in Corpus Christi a few weeks ago. Wonderful fellow. And many years ago when he was a priest, he signed up with one of these agencies that basically profiles your tissue. And you get into a data bank, and then over the years they check for all the people who need to get a transplant. Stem cell transplant, and he matched. So he went to San Antonio. Basically, they hooked him up. They put something into his arm. They did pheresis on his blood and removed enough of these cells that they could use them to treat this woman, this mother of 3 children, and save her life. So, you know, it was a wonderful gesture on his part, and his willingness to stick with the commitment that he made many years earlier to help her out and ultimately save her life.
Well, finally, a happy story with stem cells.
Yeah,
so I'm glad we could take you there. Father Tad, thank you as always.
Thank you so much.
Father Tad's commentary can be found at the National Catholic Bioethics Center website at ncbcenter.org. She's editor-at-large at National Review Online and an award-winning journalist. She recently joined me to talk about new HHS rules governing faith-based adoption and foster care, as well as her new book, a devotional titled A Year with the Mystics, Visionary Wisdom for Daily Living. Here's my interview with KATHRYN LOPEZ. KATHRYN, before we get to A Year with the Mystics, which I do want to talk about, you have been focused in a lot of your reporting on adoption and particularly religious-based foster care and adoptions. Why has this drawn your attention?
Well, a couple of years ago, I realized after 2 decades of writing about pro-life issues, we don't talk enough about adoption and foster care, right? And this is a problem because there are birth mothers who don't appreciate what heroes there are. There are pregnant women who don't appreciate that there are couples who would do anything for a child. This is a problem because there are children in foster care that none of us think about, generally speaking. And so, yeah, I just think it's really important, and particularly Catholics, you know, because we have such a rich history in adoption and foster care. But in recent years, right, so many Catholic charities and other faith-based entities have gotten out of it because of clashes with the government and laws. And so we have to start rethinking what this looks like. And I think evangelicals have an advantage over us. And so I've been trying to bring evangelicals and Catholics together. the advantage is they don't think bureaucratically in the way that we do. So we give money to a cardinal's appeal or whatever it is, and we assume someone's taking care of all the needs, right? Evangelicals have one church. They have to look around their community to see what the needs are. And so they have lots of models that I think Catholic parishes should start looking at in a new way. And I think Catholic parishes really have to start thinking in terms of, all right, who are we and what can we do, and not rely on, the bishop has to do something, or and so I just think adoption and foster care is an area where we really have to be thinking more.
The Trump HHS department recently changed a rule that spoke to these foster care and religiously based adoption agencies, that they can, based on their religious beliefs, decide who to place a child with. This is Vice President Mike Pence talking about that rule change. Watch.
We reversed the rule implemented in the closing days of the last administration that jeopardized the ability of faith-based providers to serve those in need by penalizing them for their deeply held religious beliefs. The truth is, 4 out of 5 families have pointed to faith and church support as a factor in successful fostering. And I'll make you one more promise. Child welfare providers will never be forced to choose between their faith and serving those in need. Not on our watch.
KATHRYN, what difference will this make tangibly in the function and running of these faith-based adoption agencies or foster care agencies?
Well, right now it doesn't tie the hands anymore of faith-based entities. Of course, the problem is when the Trump administration ends or Republicans aren't in power, what is this going to look like? So there's a lot of work to be done in terms of educating people on this, and people need to be looking at the faces of these children who are in the system, but also need to appreciate that we're not going to solve all of our differences in the lifespan of the chance that these kids have, right? And one of the most encouraging things that actually I've experienced in the course of doing this over the last couple of years is I had a forum at the National Review Institute after the Catholic Prayer Breakfast one year, 2 years ago, and Walter Olson, a libertarian who works at the Cato Institute, who's married to a man who's adopted, said to me, we need religious entities in this area, and I'm fighting for your freedom alongside you. And we need more coalitions like that of people who can agree to disagree on even fundamentals, because right now, we need to help these kids, and I think it's really important, like with some of these transgendered issues and whatnot, we're seeing some interesting coalitions, and people appreciating their fundamental freedoms here and dignity of human life, right? These children flourish if they're in a family. They don't if they're stuck in the system. And so we've got to help them.
The numbers are pretty staggering. I mean, over 400,000 children in the United States are in foster care. More than 100,000 are adoptable. What's the obstacle?
Right. Well, first of all, because not many of us are thinking about this. I mean, there really needs to be a culture change. But the hopeful thing about those numbers is that if every church every Christian church in the United States made this a priority, one family in every church. We're not saying everyone needs to adopt. Not everyone's called to do this, right? But do you know who the families in your parish are who have adopted children, who are foster parents, who do respite care?
Right.
Many of us don't. And that's the problem, because there's a role for all of us in this.
Right.
Providing date nights for the foster parents, making food once a week, getting a schedule together to help these families, because often these families are dealing with children who have deep trauma issues, sometimes mental illness because of opioid addiction and all these terrible things that may have happened to them. And so we need a culture change.
Yeah. I want to talk about the book for a moment. Now, St. Benedict's Press have been for years releasing these A Year With series, and it's a year with this one and a year with that one. How did you, first of all, get attached to this project, A Year with the Mystics, and why did you want to do this?
Well, I had been interviewing previous collators of these books. And I talked to Paul Thigpen. He did The Saints and Mary, I think. And I said, you know, and he was an editor there at the time. And I said, you guys really need to do, I think I suggested the women mystics. And so they said, yeah, well, we've been wanting you to do a book, so why don't you do that? And I came up with lots of reasons for me not to, but I eventually wound up doing it. And I'm really grateful because I spent a lot of time with these holy people.
Why the mystics? Why focus
well,
on
I
and they're not all, we should stipulate. Some of the people you mentioned in the book, some are living, they are certainly spiritually advanced, but they're not all mystics qua mystic.
Well, we think of like John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila as mystics, right? Doctors of spirituality, right? Catherine of Siena, another one who's in there. But I thought it was really important, like the Catechism talks about mysticism as union with God. That's the journey of our lives. Everyone's called to it, to whatever degree whatever God wants to do with it, right? We just need to give God time. And so I thought it was important to include Elizabeth Ann Seton, who we know from schools and hospitals doing stuff, right? And Mother Cabrini, the patron saint of immigrants, and your beloved Mother Angelica.
Mother Angelica made the cut on page 157, I might add.
It's taken just directly from one of your books.
Well, she was special, and I love the moment. The selection you chose from her was about living a life in prayer.
Right.
How do you live actively ceaseless prayer, which is a big deal for her, and for all of us, because in fact it's something we rarely talk about.
Right.
Another thing.
We never talk about it. Exactly. And nothing that she did, we would not be sitting here right now, Raymond, if it weren't for her prayer life, right? She knew Jesus in a way that we're supposed to, but many of us don't. And so I wanted the book to be an encouragement to people, and because it's a one-a-day format, there's never more than 400 words on a page. This is something you can do. You know, our friend Gary Jansen wrote a book that was the 15-minute prayer solution. He points out that 1% of the day is 15 minutes. Everybody can give God 15 minutes.
15 minutes.
1% of the day.
It's the least you can do. You talked in an interview about a lot of noise in the world and the feeling that you're alone. What does one find in those moments of prayer once you dedicate yourself to it?
Well, especially when you really focus, as some of these saints, Gertrude the Great comes to mind, really focused on Jesus on the cross. You know, look at Jesus on the cross. And when you start to really go deeper into that love, how can you think that you're alone, right? I mean, he died for you, you know? And I just think it's so important. I mean, everybody's talking about the epidemic of loneliness, right? Suicide is everywhere, it seems. And this is part of the solution. I mean, and I'm not downplaying people need medical help, obviously, for clinical depression and mental illness and stuff. But if all of us who are Christian, who say that we love and want to serve God, if we live this life more, if we really give Him time and really seek His will, things look different. You know, you treat people differently.
How did you choose which mystics to include? Well,
some of it is sort of a lifetime of tearing meditations out of Magnificat and bookmarking books, and at the end of the day, to be honest with you, it's 365, and I was like doing my job while I was doing this. There are priests in New York, maybe they're watching, New York and Washington, who think that I'm a homeless person with a laptop. I don't know where they think I charge my laptop, but I sat in front of the Blessed Sacrament and I just, please guide me. And so at the end, hopefully it's his order, not mine.
What do you want people to take from this?
Well, I want them to come to know God more and see Him everywhere. And I think when...
to use it as a field guide almost.
Yeah. And I think it opens... those meditations have opened my eyes and my heart. And I see people in the world differently. And I have a big beat up copy. It is really indestructible because I put it through a lot in my purse. But I'm using it every day, and I'm just tremendously grateful for the opportunity.
Well, if any editor can return to the work and still be edified by it, that's a great work.
Well, it also means I had nothing to do with it.
Exactly. KATHRYN Lopez, great to see you. Thank you for being here. A Year with the Mystics, Visionary Wisdom for Daily Living by KATHRYN Lopez is available everywhere and online. My next guest is the mother of Mattie Stepanek, the prolific poet, peace advocate, and philosopher who captured the hearts of media figures and the public alike. Countless souls have been touched by his message and the Catholic faith that informed it. Jenny Stepanek carries on that message despite her own physical challenges. She's really a living example of courageous living with disability as well as loss. I sat down with her this past summer to talk about the state of Maddie's cause for sainthood, and her longtime family friend, Cheryl Kerwin, shared her remembrances of Maddie and his message of hope. Here's my interview with Dr. Jenny Stepanek.
It seems Maddie's message has exploded in the last few months, in the last year or so. What's happening? Why do you think that is? And in what way is it exploding?
Both Maddie's Foundation, which is the Peace Mission, and Maddie's Guild, which you founded to consider his cause of canonization. You're right, in the last 6 to 12 months, there's really been a transition from little events and organizing and kind of putting things out there to people saying, we want more. And with the foundation, we now have the governor of Maryland on board and the senators and all these schools and camps saying, we need more, we need more, we love this message. Mm-hmm. And really the Guild, that back in 2010 when you talked about it, 2012 when you founded it, mm-hmm. I feel like the first 5 or 6 years it was really, what is this Guild? Who is this Guild? What does a Guild even do? Yeah. And suddenly in the last year, the Guild has nonprofit status. It has firm directors. It's moved from organizing mm-hmm. to gathering witness testimony and organizing that. At the website, social media, events. Why? I would say there's really 2 major things going on. And one is it's a new generation of people that are suddenly hearing about Maddie for the first time, because we're 15 years out from his presence on earth. And the other is that we're now also moving into almost 20 years since some major life events in our world. Mm-hmm. And back in 2001 when Maddie shared For Our World and Just Peace, and he's on Oprah for the first time, and mm-hmm. It's going on almost 20 years since then, and I think that we can do this. Peace is possible, life is worthy. Mm-hmm. I think people are realizing we need to commit ourselves to peace and hope and life and our neighbors again.
Tell me how Maddie was different from other children. I mean, you've had your own children, you had grandchildren.
Right.
Why was he different?
The things he spoke about at such an early age, one of the things I would like to impart is my Maddie moment of his 2nd birthday party. This is a child who was supposed to die. He was baptized right after birth because they weren't sure what was going to happen. He then had a formal baptism. So it kept progressing, and here we are now. He was 2 years old, living in a small house with a big backyard is what I remember, because the birthday party was it was summer, you know, July, summer, so I had a big party. And he, you know, Maddie had a trach, he had learned to sign language because he couldn't breathe on his own when he was first born and in the beginning. So at that party, there were neighbors, there were those of us from his parish, Mount Calvary Catholic Church, and then doctors, nurses, and staff from the hospital where he had, you know, been in and out of all this time. And that's what struck me, was these doctors and nurses that I spoke with walking around at the party, to a person, said they had no idea why he was here, that he should not have made it. They had no earthly, if you will, explanation.
Tell me about that mission of peace, that message of peace. When did you become aware that this was important to him?
I would say maybe a year or two after after his second birthday, my next Maddie moment is in Upper Marlboro, Maryland, at the home they were living in, the home they had. He was about 3-ish, 3.5, 4. And again, the level of a child that age, yes, he played. He was obviously, because he was home, he was well enough to be doing things. He wasn't in the hospital. But he would be in costume a lot of times, either when I arrived or shortly after I arrived. He'd have a sword in his hand. He'd be a knight. He'd be Robin Hood. He was a dragon, I think, one time when I went over. But then you never knew. I mean, he was talking. And this is when I realized, and you know, how astute Jenny was, that she was writing things down. These were his poems. These were these beginning poems. And it was like, what child at 3 talks about God, talks about heaven? And he was a regular churchgoer, so it wasn't completely unusual, but the level of like knowing where heaven was. No, my 3-year-old granddaughter wouldn't have known that. And then he'd run around and all of a sudden he'd be in front of us and say, why is there war? Why are people hating each other? And again, that's not normal talk for a child that age.
Now, he was also a lector at your parish.
Well, that was my next Maddie moment. Is it wasn't my parish. She had moved to another, this was that Most Holy Rosary. But when I found out, my husband and I found out that he was lecturing already at this young age, we would go sometimes to Mass when Maddie was there. And again, knew this was different. This is a child at this young age. He knew, Raymond, he knew what he was saying. He knew he was proclaiming the Word of God.
And you were also struck by how attuned he was to current events at a young age.
One of my favorite of his poems is the Note to Bosnia. So that was something I mean, again, what child is watching that on TV and being affected by it?
What do you think of the possibility, of the prospect of Maddie and a cause for Maddie moving forward? Did you see that virtue, that heroic virtue?
To me, again, he was beating the odds, not just with his physical disabilities. I was unfortunately or fortunately around for the divorce time period too. And that, you know, there were things there that were definitely affecting Maddie, but yet he was still full of joy. He was still a fun-loving young little boy. So I felt like he was beating adversity.
I've always been struck in reading Jenny's book and talking to people who knew him, his concern for other people.
Yes.
What did you see of him going out to others, concern for others?
When I went to book signings, his care for I mean, he was mesmerizing to both children and adults, because most of them had already read some of his poetry, seen some of it, and now, you know, we're coming to get yet another of his books. And his care, you know, he might not have been feeling well, he might not have been on his best day, but you sure didn't know it. You didn't, the kids were all, you know, he wanted to talk to them individually. That was, to me, you know, striking. He's definitely someone that God gave the fruits of the Holy Spirit: love, joy, peace, generosity, and he used those gifts. So many of us don't use those gifts, but he did.
Tell me about the cause. In November, the prayer, Maddie's prayer was unveiled. There was a nice, huge reaction to it.
Yes.
Where do you see the cause now? And it's got to be difficult as his mother to see this cause taking shape, which is moving toward canonization.
Where the cause is now is as more people are either remembering Maddie, they're re-remembering him, or they're learning about him for the very first time in school or through news or through the Peace Day events. As that's happening, we're getting this sudden surge of people that are sending through social media, through letters, through snail mail, through email, Maddie inspires me, Maddie inspires me, my life is different because of Maddie. And where the cause is now is trying to help people know how to share that information in a way that would advance the cause.
And I know on the maddieforsainthood.org website, they're also asking to be a part of creating Maddie's Book of Virtues. What is that?
My understanding of that is that the beginning of the cause, and the mommy of me says this is the hardest part, okay? It is establishing that this is a child who lived a challenging life, not just disability. He also knew what it was like to be bullied. He knew what it was like to watch a world falling apart when he feels like his job is to be a peacemaker and a messenger of hope and peace. So it's more than disability that was his suffering. He knew what it was like to bury siblings, to have a mother with a disability, to go through divorce. So to establish that he lived a challenging life and yet chose to live that life with purpose from God, to live in a virtuous way, to live with kindness, hope, faith, peace, charity, you know, all the things that we define as virtues. So to establish that both through everything that he wrote, everything that people wrote about him and to him when he was alive, and then to support that with letters and testimony from people who either remember him or never knew him but knew of him or are learning of him now. And you asked earlier how hard that is for me. On one hand, it's very exciting to think that my son's life, which he lived his life for God, he lived with purpose, with choice, deliberately sharing messages that were placed in his heart by God. And he chose to play after storms. He chose to comfort the baby in the next bed in the ICU rather than tend to his own emotions. He did that for God, and so it's very exciting, and I'm in awe that here we are 15 years later and it's advancing. It's also difficult because it means my son is not here. I would so much rather have my son turn 29 this summer and I say, where do you want to go for dinner? Than where are we going to have a Maddie symposium so we can tell people about his life.
What do you think as a mother when you read these recollections and remembrances of Maddie? I mean, are you learning anything about him?
Oh, I am. There are stories that people share that I didn't know. I mean, people remind me of things that I've forgotten. I continue. I mean, I'm getting letters from, there's a man that is taking Maddie messages to youth in Rikers Island, that are incarcerated youth. And then the youth who aren't even allowed to have pencils with erasers because they might take the metal off. I mean, so they're writing with little stubby pencils. Letters to me about Maddie's character is teaching me that I can choose my character, that even if I live a rough life, even if my parents are divorced, or even if I've witnessed violence, I can still choose hope and peace, and I can live a life of purpose. To hear things from people who have disabilities that are inspired, or people who question life for themselves. Yes, I mean, some of it is uplifting for me, and some of it is new, and it's all very inspiring.
As you said, Maddie would have been 29 this July 17th. What's the heart of that message that goes on, that's needed?
That hope is real. It's not an illusion, and that hope is an energy that moves us into the next moment. That peace is possible, and here's how peace is possible. Get to know your neighbor, talk to your neighbor, educate, tend to basic human needs. Learn to be okay with yourself. Even if you're different and have challenges, you can still be okay if your needs are tended to. And when you are okay, move from here to here and ask your neighbor, are you okay? Learn about resilience and kindness. Teach this to other children, to elected leaders, and that life is worthy.
As you look forward to his possible sainthood, How do you see that cause proceeding? If you had to define what Maddie might advocate formally.
I know what I would say would be what Maddie wanted to advocate for. And Maddie wanted to advocate for all people, particularly children and youth, because children and youth then inspire adults and leaders who want to take care of the children and youth. So he saw that as the full circle. Maddie reached out to infants, to children, to teenagers, and to the elderly. He did not want to be limited to people with disabilities. He wanted to be a messenger for those youth who are on the streets and think they're caught in gangs. So I think Maddie today would be inspired knowing that the imam and pastor in Nigeria have brought Maddie's message to warring gangs that are Muslim and Christian, and they're now called Maddie's ambassadors, and they're now peaceful with each other rather than hurting each other. I think he would want to be a messenger for all people who are searching for hope, searching for peace.
For more on Maddie Stepanek, his amazing life and cause, visit MaddieMatters.org. He's an auxiliary bishop in Kazakhstan and a staunch defender of traditional church teaching. I spoke with him at length recently about the controversial Amazon Synod and his new book with journalist Diane Montagna called Christus Vincit, Christ's Triumph over the Darkness of the Age. Here's my exclusive interview with Bishop ATHANASIUS Schneider.
First of all, you say you wrote this because we're living in a dark age, in a dark time. Explain that.
That we are living in a dark time, we have not to prove. It is already too evident. And so only a blind person could say we are living in the springtime or in a new Pentecost, as we heard these words 50, 60 years ago during the council.
Yes.
Now we are living in a winter, in a cold spiritual winter in the church.
Why did you decide to write this now and call it Christ's Triumph over the Darkness of the Age?
Well, the title in Latin is Christus Vincit. It is a famous and known song of the Catholics that's saying that Christ is the victor, he is the winner, the conqueror. And so, in this way, I decided to do this interview in a book form to give some strength and consolation and spiritual help to so many people, in the first place to the little ones in the church, to the laity, who in this time are thirsting so much for the clarity, for the truth.
Tell me, because I know your first book, I believe, was on the Eucharist, particularly about the reception of the Eucharist, the sacrality of the Eucharist. You address it once again in the new book. How is the Eucharist, in some ways, perhaps in the only way, the way back?
The Eucharist is the heart of the church. The church is built up from the Eucharist. As John Paul II wrote in his last encyclical, Ecclesia de Eucharistia, saying that the church is built up and lives from the Eucharist. So the Eucharist is the true heart of the church. And so when the heart is weak, so the entire body is weak. So we have first to strengthen the heart of the church, and this is the Eucharist, the veneration of the Eucharist, the worship of the Eucharist. And the Eucharist is not only something, it is Him, Christ. And therefore, my first book, I gave the title, It is the Lord.
Former Vice President Joe Biden was denied communion last Sunday at a parish. He presented himself. The priest told him no, not once, but twice. That priest is being criticized. Some saying you are politicizing the sacrament. You're weaponizing the Eucharist.
What is your reaction to that
No,
decision by the priest?
this is not convincing. This is an argument which we cannot accept, because here is at stake the Holy of Holiest in the Church, our Lord Himself. And if we would admit such a person who publicly supports very grievous sins as the killing of innocent human beings, unborn children, and other, he cannot be admitted to Holy Communion, because what is Holy Communion? It is an expression that you are the most united with Christ, with His commandments, and with the entire Church. And this would be a lie. To admit such a person to a Holy Communion, we would commit a lie. And so it is, I consider it's very heroic and courageous of this priest who denied this person the Holy Communion. He denied him this, and he did good, because it was for the spiritual good of this person. Because if such a person receives the Holy Communion in such an attitude, it is a harm for this person, and he eats his judgment, as St. Paul says. And therefore, we have to support such a priest.
Your Excellency, you spend a chapter in the book, Christus Vincit, discussing secularism and this new dictatorship, which I would suspect is responsible for much of what we've been discussing, the ambiguity in the Church, the ambiguity and the confusion we see. This is what you write. Now we have reached a peak of secularism, of this complete independence of man, of this enormous anthropocentrism, where everyone decides for himself what is true and what is good or evil. Such secularism brings us a horrible and cruel society. We are witnessing this. It is cruel. And what is the result? Egoism. Secularism leads to egoism. We have now reached a peak of egoism, and egoism is cruel. Only I and no one else. Where does this lead? This idea, this thinking, this pervasive movement in society, and how is this related to Benedict XVI's dictatorship of relativism?
Yes, maybe we can go back further. This secularism and anthropocentrism is, to my opinion, the core of sin itself. Because when Adam and Eve sinned, they want to be without God. And so this is secularism, without God. We alone, God no. We exclude God. And this is the core of every sin. And this is the continuous temptation of man, individually and collectively, to exclude God, or from their personal life or the social life. But there cannot be a vacuum. When you exclude God, you have to put something in this place.
In it.
And these are idols. And therefore, the entire humanity lived in idolatry. And this was the gravest sin in the Jews, the Hebrew people. And all the prophets continuously fought against this deep sin. But then Christ redeemed us from all sins, but especially from this gravest sin of idolatry, of secularism.
When you were last here, we spoke about the interreligious dialogue, particularly the Abu Dhabi document, which I'll get to in a moment. In the book, you spend a chapter, an entire chapter, devoted to Islam and the de-Christianization of Europe. And you write this: for several years now in Europe, we have been witnessing a massive influx and presence of Islam, and its effect is supplanting and, in some cases, overtly opposing what remains of Christian European culture. But since the recent war in Syria, the influx of Muslims into Europe has been, at least in part, organized by those who plan to Islamicize Europe. And to Islamicize Europe means practically to destroy Christianity in the region, to de-Christianize Europe. What's to be gained by de-Christianizing Europe? By whom?
The only one religion, as we already said, the only true one religion willed by God, it is the Catholic Church, the Catholic, the Christianity. And this is the only one religion which is supernatural. Supernatural. To give God the place, the central place, the true God, this is Jesus Christ, the incarnate God in our life, in the public life. And so, and the secularism, starting in the 18th century, specifically then supported and spread with the Freemasonic ideology and political powers, was to eliminate Christianity, or at least the influence of the light of Christ in the public life. And they did this throughout 200 years, and now Europe is practically not more Christian in the public life, and in this vacuum now is coming the Islam. And this is also a strategical movement to use the Islam to further de-Christianize Europe, which already was de-Christianized through the secularism in the European countries.
And we need to talk about the other, as I said a moment ago, we talked about that Abu Dhabi statement that the Pope signed earlier this year. In it he says, or the document says, the pluralism and the diversity of religions, color, sex, race, and language are willed by God in his wisdom. Does God really will that kind of pluralism, religious pluralism, other religions?
Of course, no. This is a contradiction to the entire divine revelation. God said in the first commandment, you shall not have other gods. And this was the constant appeal of the prophets in the Old Testament. And Jesus Christ also said, there is no other way than I. I am the way only. Jesus said, I am the truth. And so this statement contradicts divine revelation to say that God wills the diversity of religions. So this is contradicting the entire revelation completely, and opens the door even to this movement which we are now witnessing in Europe, to welcoming the spread of the Islamic religion. According to the statement of this phrase in the Abu Dhabi document, God wills the diversity and pluralism of religion, so God wills also the Pachamama religion with their cult. It was a logical consequence. And so we see we have to go again back to the roots and reject this phrase in this statement or similar statements as contradicting divine revelation.
Another subject you cover in your book is the doctrinal confusion, which we have been seeing over the last few years here. I want you to react to a point in the book where you talk about decentralization. Here's the quote. There can be no decentralization in doctrinal matters. Otherwise, the Catholic Church would be transformed into countless doctrinally different Christian denominations, as we can see occur daily in the Protestant world. There can be a decentralization in pastoral approaches, which of course always have to be in conformity with doctrine. How do you square that with the synodal approach to governance that we're seeing coming out of Rome?
Yes, we have to clarify what does mean synodal.
Yes.
It is, to my opinion, only a means to promote an agenda, a specific agenda.
Which agenda?
The agenda to Protestantize the Catholic Church further, and to introduce new doctrines and new practices in the Church, as we already mentioned, in the Synod of the Amazon, the abolition of the priestly celibacy, or the introduction of a female diaconate, and so on. And the equality and diversity of all religions. This is a further step, and they only use the word synodality for this aim.
You talk about the loss of the supernatural in the book. You dedicate a whole chapter to that as well. How important is it to recover a sense of the supernatural, and why has it been lost? People clearly want it. I see it when I speak to children in schools. They have a very refined sense of the supernatural. You have to almost beat it out of them. What has happened to us as a society and the church?
Yes, supernatural is God himself. His divine life is supernatural. By definition, creature and creatures are natural, not supernatural. This is the basic difference between God and the creature, the supernatural. And the greatest gift and mercy of God was that he was so condescending to us, to invite us, feeble, humble creatures, from our nature, simple nature, to go to this other level of life and knowledge in his life, his own divine life. This is supernatural, to give us a part, to take part in his own life. And so the Amazon Synod was the contrary of the gospel, because the main impact and stress was put on the material aspects of the nature, of the temporal, so not of the supernatural.
Yeah. Before I let you go, you talk here about reforming the church at the end of the book. What would be your recommendations to reform the College of Cardinals?
We have to reform, of course, the College of Cardinals with men who are true men of God, who are true apostles, who have the purity, integrity of the Catholic and apostolic faith, as it is called in the canon of the Mass. We have to renew the College of Cardinals with men who are in some way 100% sure in the purity and integrity of the Catholic faith and also in moral life.
What would be your advice to the layman watching tonight, considering all that's coming out of Rome now and that they're hearing in their own communities and around the world?
First, I would say, dear brothers and sisters from the laity, I thank you very much as a bishop for your fidelity, which you have kept in these dark times. Please keep this fidelity and read good the catechism, which you know, better the old catechism, because this is clear and simple and reflects the gospel. And this is one advice to you. And the other, to pray in family, to pray the rosary, to make hours of reparation for the sins of the high clergy who betray today Christ, and also to pray for good new priests, and to support good bishops who are still are, that they have courage and strength and wisdom to be faithful shepherds in these dark times.
Christus Vincit, Christ's Triumph Over the Darkness of the Age by Bishop Athanasius Schneider is available at bookstores everywhere, online and through EWTN's religious catalog. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com. Be sure to join us next week. I think we have a Christmas show next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.